With respect to Ambassador Gnehm, many of you have already heard from him and about him. I won't go on at length except to say Skip is one of the people I've known the longest in the Foreign Service. When you work for your country for 36 years, not all of it in the Middle East, but certainly his strongest focus is, in regional terms, was in the Middle East. You come away with an extraordinary amount of patience, skill, and understanding. But the fact that somebody lasts that long in the Foreign Service also says a lot about their commitment. It isn't an easy lifestyle, moving from one place to another. And the Foreign Service personnel system also is not always that workable. They don't really take into account everything that you want to do at any given moment in time. Is that safe to say? But Skip has been our ambassador in Jordan and in Kuwait. Gulf security in the arena of Middle East studies in this country isn't studied and professed, if you will, as widely as it should be. And it's a real treat to have Skip here who does do Gulf security and on a profound basis. So without any more ado, Skip will turn the time to you.
Thank you, Fred, very much. And you have been a friend for a long time, one I treasure. And happy to have the time to be with you and with everyone, actually. It's been a nice day and a half so far, and looking forward to the remainder. So I'm going to speak a little bit. I'm taking some notes out of some other lectures that I've given. So I will paste, and I will admit immediately that the number of the things that I may talk about, I'm going to talk very simplistically, meaning I'm going to go through them rather swiftly, on the grounds that it's just difficult to cover all the issues that I'd like to cover in the detail that I would like to do. So if you want that, you have to come to GW and join my course and pay the outrageous tuition that they ask you to pay. So anyway, let me begin by just saying that the U.S. interest in the Persian Gulf have been clearly enunciated through the years by a number of different presidents. And at this point, in reality, the U.S. really is in the position of being guardian of the Gulf, a terminology that was coined some years ago. We are very, very central to coordinating and providing a Gulf security regime. It's not always been the case. It's been an evolution over time, but in every case, it's been derivative and I would say a consequence of what the U.S. has in fact defined as its national interest in. And what are they? Well, I would begin, because I think one needs to be entirely honest on this, oil. 3 letters put together in the right order, oil. And that's because 60% of, if not 65%, of the proven oil reserves in the world are in countries that touch the Persian Gulf, the waters of the Persian Gulf. And also 40% of the natural gas reserves in the entire world are located in the same geographic waters. So with that kind of knowledge, then you go immediately to the question then of why Persian Gulf oil is so important to a country like the United States that produces so much oil and in fact buys most of its oil from Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Nigeria. You haven't heard me mention a Gulf country, but I would add one, Saudi Arabia. Not large, but some. But if we are not buying really very much of our oil from there, why do we care? And it comes right to the word of a global market for oil, for petroleum. And the word supply and demand, for those of you who study economics, you'll be on board with me for that. What I mean by that is that you have a certain demand, total demand globally for oil, and you have suppliers who meet that demand. And it doesn't really matter whether you or I buy our oil in one place or another, as much as that there be oil available for all those who demand it. In other words, if something happened to the flow of that oil from the Persian Gulf, those countries that buy from the Gulf, and that's mostly Asia, will go to other marketplaces. And where are they going to go? They're going to go to Nigeria, Venezuela, and probably Canada. so that they're going to be competing with you for the oil that you purchase there. So again, the word that politicians use all the time about oil independence. We're going to produce oil so we don't have to depend on those awful countries out in the region. And they mean Saudi Arabia mostly, but others. And it's just not going to happen. And it's diversity of supply, it's diversity of purchasing that makes your security in oil effective. So oil. And it's the free flow of that oil from the Gulf, right? It doesn't do any good if it's there, but it can't get to market. So we've often just talked about and provided protection for the oil tankers and others to be able to exit the Gulf to the world markets. We also have an interest in supporting the moderate governments in the region because we have other issues beyond oil. Daish represents, of course, the terrorism, but terrorism and terrorist activities with support from the region. And we look to moderate governments to be allies in dealing with that problem. And so their stability, their protection falls into the area of U.S. interest. And also, I would add that as derivative of those sort of definitions, comes a philosophy which has been applied over the decades, which is that the United States wanted to be certain that the Gulf region was not dominated by a hostile power. Now, if you go back to Eisenhower and the presidents who followed in the 50s and the 60s into the 70s, that danger was seen as communism and the Soviet Union and its efforts to encroach southward from Central Asia toward the Persian Gulf. But in 1979, 1980, we redefined that to include regional states who we defined as hostile and therefore did not want to be dominant in the Gulf. And what were we talking about? We were talking about Iran after the Islamic Revolution, and we were talking about Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So that approach to security and our interest in the Gulf, again, has been something that has been sustained through many years. Events in the region then have forced us to take actions. Clearly, the Iraq-Iran war, 7-year war between Iraq and Iran, when oil tankers from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia were being attacked, the United States responded by deploying a very large naval presence, escorting ships, and preserving that flow of oil out of the Gulf. 1990, 91, the invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqis, and the United States leading the world in establishing a coalition of forces, including Arab armies, Syrian and Egyptian in particular, and other GCC, to liberate Kuwait. 2003 and up to 11, the U.S. military intervention and occupation of Iraq, just those 3 examples of our engagement in a very significant way. Now, the first 2 actions, supporting the movement of oil tankers and the liberation of Kuwait, really aimed at maintaining or even restoring the status quo, right? The third one wasn't. The third one was a very dramatic effort on the part of the United States to change the power structure in the region. It was to replace a dictator, but to put in place democracy, right? This is not status quo. This is a real change in the dynamics in the region. Looking always, as the United States tries to do, to build a security structure, architecture in the Gulf, leads me to just mention one moment in time, making it illustrative of the problems that we face when we do try to think in terms of an architecture for security. This was post-liberation Kuwait. This was in the 91, 2, 3 period of time. President Bush really wanted to see a different approach to security that didn't engage the United States to the same extent that he'd had to do. With encouragement, the 6 states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, working and talking to the 2 main Arab governments who provided troops, the Syrians and the Egyptians, came out with something called the Damascus Declaration, 6+2. And this declaration promoted the idea, or at least proposed, that Egypt and Syria would maintain a troop presence in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait that would be paid for entirely by the Gulf states to provide that contingency force in case it was needed. And in return for the two states being willing to do this, the rich Arab states of the GCC were going to establish an economic development fund that would fund projects in Egypt and Syria, enhance them. It went nowhere. Why? The Arabs in the Gulf started thinking about just what would come with Syrian and Egyptian troops. None of them wanted the Ba'athi ideology of Assad. And then they began to think about Egyptians and the Egyptian view of their role in the region. And then they began to realize that if you have Arab forces in your country and there are other issues unrelated to your own security that are coming up in the region, suddenly you had two foreign forces that could intimidate or influence or at least constrain how you would act on those issues. So down the drain it went. But before it went all the way down the drain, the rich Arab states began to hear from Egypt in particular, but Syria as well, about just how much money they anticipated getting from the rich Arab states, and that was just too much for those Arabs who really like their money and don't like to give it away. Any of the older people here who ever had to deal with any of these governments know exactly what I'm talking about. So what do we fall back on? Well, the GCC states decided we can do this ourselves. Let's put together a really effective GCC military. And they asked the Sultan of Oman, Sultan Qaboos, if he would lead a group, put together some advisors, and come up with an architecture for that. He did. He presented it. Everybody lauded it, said this is magnificent and wonderful. And the Saudis said this is just great. The headquarters will be in Riyadh. A Saudi general will run this, and the other five left quietly from the room. It went on the shelf, and it was never again resurrected, at least not in those terms. And why? Because the smaller five states just simply were not going to subjugate themselves to Saudi dominance. The states in the region really are allied together in their own national interest from outside threats, but within it, they are very much divided in their approaches. They each have different domestic situations to deal with. They each have different relationships with external powers. Oman, for example, has a very good relationship with Iran. That is not true of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, right? So there are divisions as well as interests that bring them together, but having their military under the Saudi was not going anywhere. So what happened? The five smaller GCC states, and I was ambassador in Kuwait at the time, each approached us and asked for a bilateral treaty agreement that would enable cooperation in the military sphere. And this is not so different from agreements that they'd had with British earlier in historic terms. But I negotiated the one with Kuwait, and there's now one with Bahrain, one with Qatar, one with the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and one with Oman, not with Saudi Arabia. And why? The Saudis have always been hesitant, this goes back to the 40s and 50s, to have any sort of agreement with a big power external to the region. And so when Roosevelt met with the King Abdulaziz Saud on a ship in the Suez Canal in 45, this was just before Roosevelt died, they actually accommodated themselves into an agreement, an understanding that oil for security is security for oil. You could figure out who is providing what. And that's really been an unwritten agreement that's just existed between us and Saudi Arabia since that time. And so the architecture then of the Gulf becomes the United States, sort of the coordinator, the maestro, if you will, of the region. And it's worked. The Central Command, the CENTCOM as we call it, for the Middle East has its regional headquarters in Qatar. The Third Army, which is the army element of Central Command, has its regional headquarters in Kuwait. The United States Air Force also has its regional headquarters in Kuwait. And the United States Navy has its Fifth Fleet presence, the base in Bahrain. So that ends up being the architecture that we're now having to deal with. Now, one of the things that I've done recently, and I think it's useful to do, and I'd like to do a bit of that with you now, is to take a look through the eyes of the 6 GCC states. How do they see the world around them when they look out? Now, this is not the U.S. view of things, but often policymakers, and I think the Americans are this way, sorry, that's a criticism, but I think it's valid, don't really think in terms of how others are looking at the very same problem we are. Now, we have our interest, we look at it in a certain way, and that's valid. But you'll come up with the right policies, you'll come up with the right decisions on your actions if you're doing it within a context of how you're going to be received, how your allies particularly are going to respond to it. So let's just take a look at 4, and I would point out to 4 major developments over the last 30 years that have created issues that we need to understand when it comes to the Gulf states. The first is the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. The second is the U.S. military invasion and occupation of Iraq. The third is the impact of the Arab Spring. And the fourth is the sudden success of Daish. You heard me say I'm not going to use the other word. So let me just talk briefly, and I realize there's limited time, but why do I pick these 4, and why are they problems, or why are they issues for the 6 Arab Gulf states? Well, the Islamic Revolution, what did it bring to the fore? It brought an Islamic republic. It brought a regime that declared that its revolution was sacred, the clerical leaders insisting that their Islamic credentials were superior to those who claimed to, in fact, be champions of the Muslim world, and that's the Saudis. There were public demonstrations in Saudi Arabia against the ruling family that were participants were Iranian pilgrims to the Hajj, disrupting it. There was a call by the then supreme leader of Iran, Khomeini, for the overthrow of these apostate monarchies across the Persian Gulf. And in 1979 was a significant attack on the Grand Mosque in Mecca. It was certainly led by a Saudi, but it's considered by most of the Saudi leadership, he was inspired by this call in Iran for overthrowing the apostate monarchy. And Saudi Arabia is not the only country to have felt Iranian belligerency. Let's go through quickly a list. Iraqi Shia extremists based in Iran and led by a Lebanese Hezbollah terrorist bombed the American embassies in Kuwait and the French embassy. In 1985, a Shiite extremist attempted to assassinate the Emir of Kuwait. During the Iraq-Iran war, the Iranians shot missiles at Iraq and hit the Kuwaiti oil refineries, and as I mentioned earlier, targeted Kuwaiti tankers. The Iranians occupied 3 islands claimed by the United Arab Emirates, still possess them. And Tehran backed an attempt to overthrow the Sunni-dominated government in Bahrain at one point. So there's ample reason for the Arab Gulf states to be concerned about this Iranian Shiite government across the way. But the nightmare of it all was the view of these Arab governments that their Shia minorities were in effect loyal to Iran because they were Shia, and were therefore fifth column movements in their own countries, minorities that were being used by Iran to effect the overthrow of the Sunni governments. Now, I don't believe that's true myself, but I'm giving you the view that they have, and they're very paranoid about this. If you look at America's war with Saddam and the occupation of Iraq, it was a cataclysmic event, as I've said earlier in some of my remarks, but it was especially alarming to the Arab states in the Gulf because it toppled the Sunni-dominating government, and it replaced it, due to our, of course, advocacy of democracy, with a government that was dominated by Iraq's majority Shia population. And again, go back to that last point I was making, suddenly they see Shia, they see the Iranian influence. They had always looked at Iraq as a bulwark against this Shia Persian country. And now you had the Shia Persians over the Zagros Mountains in the plains of Iraq, the Euphrates, Tigris, right on the border of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Again, alarming there. And of course, they saw Maliki, the then prime minister, as very pro-Iranian and using his position to enhance the power of the Shias. And then let's look quickly at the Arab Spring. I'm not going to go through what I've heard already, and you have too, really excellent presentations about the Arab Spring and its aftermath. But the point to make here is that even though you don't find in the press, the media, the same dramatic developments in the streets or squares, except say Bahrain, excepting Bahrain, there were ramifications, and there are ramifications. The same issues that you find in Egypt, in Tunisia, which have been discussed by others, but elsewhere in the region exist in these countries I'm talking about. Corruption, the treatment of citizens, these are human rights abuses, lack of transparent government, refusal by the ruling families to share power. Those are there, and it's seething underneath. And so the governments, as they look at Iran and its threat, as they look to Iraq in the north and the changes in the political power structure, they also sense an alarming development internally. They were also concerned about the way the United States reacted, that we did not support Mubarak, that they considered our ally and friend, reminding them that we didn't support the Shah when he was toppled. And then the question was clearly, what does that mean for us? Is the United States going to be there for us? And then there's this whole issue of the Muslim Brotherhood that comes out of the Egyptian experience. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. And they've done so because of an experience that they've had with the Muslim Brotherhood in recent years. They have members, they allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to come in. The Muslim Brotherhood organized. They embedded themselves in the country's educational institutions and in the political culture, up to the point of actually threatening the political order in those countries. Again, this is the view of the ruling families and the way they look at what's happening. The Arab states did respond to these threats that come out of the Arab Spring. The rich ones used money, as they have done before. The Saudis deployed troops, as you know, to Bahrain to put down the insurrection, or I would just call it demonstrations for human rights, for personal rights in Bahrain, and as I said, declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. And then there's the rise of Daish. I almost said the other word, sorry. In June of 1914, of course, dramatically, the Salafi group that calls itself the Islamic State captured Iraq's second largest city, giving them control of 1/3 of Iraq in a mere 6-month period of time. I would say that the Arab states looked at horror upon this development because Daesh challenged the legitimacy of all the governments. In other words, establishing a caliphate. They were saying that all of the existing governments and regimes were outside the parameters of Islam, and they should be toppled. The boundaries shouldn't have existed to begin with, because the Muslim world, the Ummah is unified, and it should not be divided. And so the people in the region really did perceive the threat to them. And as we've watched, and they have watched, the way Daesh has exercised its power, I'm just talking about the atrocities in particular, they are more and more, the populations are more and more estranged from what maybe initially was an empathy or a sympathy for Daesh. But what these Gulf states also know is that they have internal, in each of their countries, structure organizations of people who really do believe in the Daesh philosophy, if I might put it that way. And they're very, very concerned that the problem is not going to come from across the border. It's going to come from within, from these groups. So again, I'm just pointing out that today, as these states look out at the world, they feel very threatened. I mean, the word beleaguered has to come to mind, because all of these things have come home, right? And they're having to deal with external threats and internal threats. And then, of course, you have Iran that appears stronger than ever, successfully really advancing its power and its influence around them. Think of Yemen. Yemen is not in the Gulf, but it's to the south of Saudi Arabia. And there, the Iranians have at least optically a presence and concern. The Saudis very, very much believe the Iranians are really behind the Houthis. And now they see this Iranian threat to them at the underbelly of the country, as well as to the north and to the east. But even more importantly, what the Saudis know, is that the population of Yemen is larger than the population of all the other states on the peninsula added together. And there are large numbers of Yemenis who work in Saudi Arabia. A porous border, serious economic situations, particularly the lack of water. I just use that one as an example. As water resources in Yemen drop drastically, there comes a point, and it's not very far down the road, where there will not be enough water for people to drink. So where are people going to go? Well, they're not going to get in airplanes and fly to America, that's a fact. They're going to cross the border and head for Saudi Arabia. And if they go with the instability and the ideologies that are there, this is a threat to Saudi Arabia, and they recognize it. And you add into that the Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula that's there. There is, in fact, a serious, serious problem. That leads me to talk about the United States and the U.S. role. As I said, it's the principal guarantor of Gulf security, and I do not see an alternative. I don't think that will change anytime soon. But let's recognize that our own relationship with these states has had its ups and downs. Clearly, when we were supporting oil shipping during the Iraq-Iran war, or when we liberated Kuwait, these are high points in the relationship. But on the other hand, these countries have a real doubt about U.S. reliability. They certainly interpreted the failure to support, as I said earlier, the Shah and Mubarak as failures to support friends, raising, again, doubts as to whether we would be there for them. But they were also perplexed that the U.S. did not seem to comprehend the threat that might follow the fall of the Iranian monarchy or the defeat of Saddam Hussein. Was America, or is America, a dependable ally? Would we be there in their time of need? And the same questions arise, coupled with a sense that the United States doesn't think through the consequences of its actions or non-actions. Trust in the U.S. to manage situations is in question. In Syria, the U.S. joined the Gulf Arab states and others in calling for the end of the Assad regime. Yet the U.S., in their minds, did not seem committed to take the actions necessary to achieve that end. They were especially upset when President Obama failed to take military action when the Syrian government crossed his red line and used chemical weapons on its citizens. In fact, they wondered today if toppling Assad is still an objective of U.S. foreign policy. And then there's Iran. The new opening between Washington and Tehran came as a total surprise to most of the states when it became public that Oman, one of them, had arranged a secret meeting between the U.S. and Iran. Going on into the U.S. negotiations with P5 plus Germany over Iran's nuclear program, this has left the GC states confused and definitely uncertain. Those states generally oppose Iran getting a nuclear weapon capability, and they certainly want to avoid a war. They want to see a peaceful resolution. Yet they harbor a belief, and it does border on a phobia, that in truth the United States sees its relationship with Iran as far more important than the one we have with them. They worry that they've been kept uninformed, unconsulted with by Washington regarding our intentions toward Tehran, and worse still, that we may make agreements or reach understandings with Iran that will affect their security, and it will be done without ever having discussed it with them. Now, there are two other developments in the region that I think increases insecurity and intensified doubts about U.S. reliability. Let me just mention them. One is oil production. As it increases in the United States and U.S. purchases or dependence on oil, particularly from Saudi Arabia, it raises that question of whether that oil for security agreement understanding is still valid. I'm not going to go further because in the interest of time. But the second one, the administration's pronouncement that the U.S. would be pivoting toward Asia really left them unsettled. What did that mean? Are you walking away? You're leaving us with Iran there and all of this other stuff that I've described. You're walking away from us. And again, raising the question of U.S. reliability as a security partner. And I think, too, it's critical to understand how the United States is viewed in the region, to go a little bit further. There was a very interesting article in the Washington Post a couple of months ago that highlighted the mistrust of American policies in the region. It quoted Mustafa Alani of the Gulf Research Center located in Dubai, and this is a quote: "We have reached a low point in trust in this administration," close quote. The article explains that such a view is rooted in 3 years of increased American disengagement, beginning with the turmoil engendered by the Arab Spring. The author notes that different countries are suspicious for different reasons, but all feel betrayed in some way. Some cite Obama's warning of military action in Syria if it used chemical weapons, yet backed off when they did. Others point to U.S. failure to supply moderate Syrian resistance forces with arms as promised. Persons argue that this failure created the conditions that enabled Daesh actually to thrive. And Sunni leaders criticized continued U.S. support for Maliki when it was clear that his policies were so sectarian that they were leading toward an even more significant division within Iraq. Now, let me just repeat that I don't think the Gulf states have any alternative to a security relationship with the United States. But there loom significant concerns and doubts about the United States and its commitment to its friends, its understanding of the region's complexities. There do remain common causes. Certainly, the actions against Daesh as well as Al-Qaeda. And yet we're going to see these states more active unilaterally in taking actions that they calculate help them survive in the region. Again, uncertain whether the United States will actually be taking the actions that they feel that we should. And of course, I was talking specifically about Iran. Let me just close with a couple of brief observations about Iran. Iran definitely is sensing that its position and prestige and role in the region has advanced, that they are stronger and better off today than they were last year or a few years ago. We need to remember that Iran is an opportunistic state. It doesn't have the power, the military might to be a military threat in the way that you would have talked about Saddam and his military in Iraq or others. What do I mean by opportunistic? That means that they know how to engage when there are problems in the region. Not problems they created, but problems that exist, and they know how to exploit them, and they do it well. They have their ties with the Assad regime. They have their Shia populations that they work with or claim to work with. In fact, it hasn't been so long ago that the supreme leader in Tehran actually said, "We are the people who have to support and defend our Shia brethren wherever they are," going back to that fear of the countries about their loyalty, the Shia loyalty. So it's still very much there. I mentioned developments in Yemen. These are all indicators or examples of how Iran can take advantage of situations. But one of the comments that I think is worth us all remembering, particularly the policymakers in America, is that what Iran really wants in life is its role in the region as a prominent and important player to be recognized. All of this opportunistic activity is aimed at trying to get us and others to say, yeah, you are important. Yeah, come in the door. And they haven't achieved that yet. So that's one card, at least, that we and others have to be able to play with the Iranians as we go into negotiations over the nuclear, but as we go into to look at other policies, as my group has been doing here during this seminar, this conference retreat. So let me just say that my conclusions are that historic and traditional U.S. interests remain, those that I mentioned earlier, and that the U.S. remains the key to Gulf security. We operate from a weaker position today after Iraq and the more recent actions that I mentioned, like in Syria and up north. We can play a positive role in coordinating opposition to Daesh and in building a security architecture in the Gulf, but we must do so using the governments there because they need to be the ones that take the primary action, both regionally and domestically, to deal with the challenges I mentioned to you earlier. So while the U.S. can play an important role, be an important player, it cannot determine the outcome. Regional states ultimately must recognize the issues they face and act, especially with Daesh, which I believe is really significantly an issue in Islam itself. They have to be the ones that deal with it. Western powers and people are not going to be successful in doing that. But we must stay engaged, and there's a tendency always for us to walk away when things get too complicated, but we must stay engaged. And that begins with very close coordination with our allies that reassure them that we're not walking away and that we are dependable and that we will be there when they need us. This partnership, in my mind, remains critical and fundamental if we really intend to achieve what we have defined as our national interest. Thank you.
We'd like to offer a few minutes for Q&A, and if you, I believe right where Troy is. Troy, there's a microphone. If you'd please avail yourself of the mic, and again, go ahead and introduce yourself if you would. We'll probably go for about 5 minutes with the 5 to 7 minutes with Q&A.
You want to bet? I've never done a 5 or 7 minute Q&A in my life.
Hi, I'm Michael McCall from Portland State University. I wanted to ask about the role of Oman in the Gulf. They definitely seem to have a separate foreign policy from the rest of the GCC countries. Is it primarily the Kharjite ideology that allows them to mend relationships per se with Iran? Is it their geographical position, the historical relationship between the two countries? What is it about Oman that allows it to pursue a relatively independent foreign policy in the region?
Well, they definitely do have one, and it's particularly apparent when it comes to Iran. And I think that it's all of the above that you mentioned. Certainly the Abadi faith, which is prevalent in Oman, is one that has a very tolerant stream in its philosophy, a belief, just not a religious lecture, but a belief that God is the judge, and that judgment comes when you go there, go to meet God. And therefore it is not within the purview of us on earth to be judging others. So when Egypt established diplomatic relations with Israel, and all of the Arab League states voted, except Oman, to break relations and did so. Oman did not. And when asked and criticized for not doing so, they said, Egypt has to do what it thinks is best, and if it was a wrong decision, they will be judged by God at some point in time, but not by us. So there is a toleration accepted, but they're also outside the Gulf, so that they are not choked by the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow neck of water, as other states are. They're also not very near Iraq, and they're also a little more distant from Iran, and they have a history with Iran of having provided support to put down a revolt, a communist-led revolt supported by South Yemen back in the 70s. So they have this historical precedent. Yeah. That doesn't mean that other states in the Gulf like their policy, but they do pursue it. Another question? I know I haven't been that clear in what I said. Quinn.
Yeah, if no one's, we'll take the opportunity. You talked a lot about the need for us to be better friends in many ways with these regimes. Do we want to be friends with these regimes who repress their people, who put down insurrections, who have some of the worst human rights records in the world? What is the role of our values in our relationship with these monarchies?
It's a great question and probably the most difficult one to answer. There's no question that while I can make a strong argument of the reasons why we do have a close relationship, I could easily take the other side of the debate table, particularly on the question of human rights, and talk why we shouldn't or couldn't, might not. I think in the end, you weigh it all together. And as you face issues and crises, you have to recognize that Saudi Arabia has in fact done and been a friend and done things that have very much supported our other interests and other factors. For example, Saudi Arabia has always been willing to produce more oil when the world crises demanded it. They did it when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait and Kuwaiti oil production came off the market. They did it when we invaded Iraq and Iraqi oil came off the market. And this is, again, vital to other of our interests. They have also been willing to be, their view of Iran parallels a great deal our view of Iran, and that has been helpful in terms of foreign policy. Then you have to deal with these areas that are not areas of mutual interest and concern. We have raised the issue of human rights, not with great effect, but I think at the time that the Arab Spring, consequences of the Arab Spring, are creating more seething inside of Saudi Arabia itself, then our conversations with the Saudis about change will have more meaning and more bearing. But in the end, I think the decision is made that national security interests trump the issues of human rights, and that's happened elsewhere in the world. Some people can't accept that, and others can. That's all I can give you in the way of an answer on that.
I'm Lucy Scatton from BYU. I wanted to ask, I was reading about last summer that Bahrain actually asked one of our diplomats to leave the country because he'd been engaging with some of their Shia minority opposition leaders. Is our relationship with Bahrain strained? Is that not a big deal?
Oh, this is a follow-on question to Quinn's. This is another example of the very issue that he raised. Yes, he was an assistant secretary of state. He was visiting Bahrain, had received a visa and an invitation, but he met with some of the Shia opposition groups. In fact, the more moderate line, mainline one. And that's outraged a certain element of the family, and he was asked to leave the country, yeah. And we were outraged, and we made it very, very clear about that. But we've had a long relationship with Bahrain and a long relationship with the monarchy itself. And the presence of the Fifth Fleet there is critically important, again, for national security reasons. And we have, on the other side of the equation, we have really put our shoulder and our words against the government's way of approaching the internal domestic situation. And we pushed the Crown Prince and others in the direction of a dialogue. We thought that was going to work, and it was actually, I'll say, overturned by the other element in the family that is really radical. I mean, it's just hard-nosed about this. And so that failed. And then we always have to calculate in this issue of Bahrain with the equities that we have with Saudi Arabia. And what are they? The Saudis clearly, and the other Arab monarchies that are Sunni, we're not prepared to see a Sunni monarchy overthrown. And the reason why this was so important to Saudi Arabia was, again, the Shia minority in the eastern provinces, right across the causeway, and concerned, as they had more trouble there, that if you had a rise of a Shia state across the causeway, it was going to just create more and more problems there. We were not happy with the Saudi deployment of forces at all, and we made it clear, but we also were not in a position to stop it.
Thank you.
These really do point to the quandaries of trying to come up with anyone who wants to call a foreign policy cohesive and consistent.
Hi, Andrew Du Bois from Trinity University. As mentioned in the other speakers' presentations earlier, the the Gulf monarchies have sort of resorted to a tougher form of authoritarianism in the wake of the Arab Spring. But I do think that eventually these absolutist regimes are going to fall, and that, you know, how should the U.S. proceed, knowing, or at least in my opinion, knowing that these regimes aren't permanent and that democratic change will eventually come, or some sort of change will eventually come, and we will need to establish a relationship with what is now the opposition. How should we proceed?
Good. Let me answer in a way that will tell you that I agree with part of what you said, and I have a different view in another part. One is that absolutely, as I think I tried to say, these problems that the Arab Spring brought out are really present, and the indigenous populations in these countries want to see change, political reform, more participatory government, et cetera, no doubt about it. And they aren't just going to sleep. They're not just rolling over because the governments are able to suppress it or buy them off. That's a fact. But I think what you see will happen is those pressures, these monarchs, and I mean these ruling families, have been around a long time. They're not insensitive to what's going on in their country. It's not like maybe the Shah was in Iran, not connected with some of the problems that were coming in his direction. No, these monarchs know how to deal with their people. What I think we're going to see is change in governance, and we're going to see change in the way the governments maintain order, whatever. In other words, less heavy-handed. Maybe not in immediate terms. I think you're right in your description of the immediacy, but I think you will see an evolution as opposed to a revolution. And so, I think in our own interest, I'm an advocate of slow, gradual change as opposed to where we've had more dramatic change. It hasn't really served our interest or served the interest, I think, of the people who live there.
Thank you.
So you're all going to sleep better tonight because you know things are so great out there in the world? Thank you all very, very much.